Currently the Director of Emergency General Surgery, Associate Professor of Surgery and Nursing, Associate Chief of the Division of Acute Care Surgery, and the Vice Chair of Clinical Operation at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine in Baltimore. Dr. Saccharin is also a Senior Fellow at the Satcher Institute at Morehouse School of Medicine. A survivor of gun violence himself, Dr. Saccharin's interest in medicine and trauma surgery began after a stray bullet nearly killed him during his senior year of high school. He has subsequently dedicated his life to treating the most vulnerable, reducing health disparities among marginalized populations, and advancing public health policy that alleviates structural violence in low-income communities. Dr. Saccharin has been recognized by numerous organizations for his public health research, specifically firearm injury prevention. He has been honored by the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality and Academy Health. In 2019, Dr. Saccharin was named a Presidential Leadership Scholar, in which he furthered his research on safe gun storage. He's selected by the National Academy of Medicine to be a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Health Policy Fellow, and he was honored to serve in the U.S. Senate in the office of New Hampshire Senator Maggie Hassan of New Hampshire, where he worked on health policy and regulatory issues from 2019 to 2020. Dr. Saccharin makes frequent appearances in print and television. He has had numerous opinion pieces for The Atlantic and CNN.com, and his work has been featured on NPR's Fresh Air with Terry Gross, MSNBC, CNN, The Israeli Times, O Magazine, and the Pell Center's Story on the Public Square. He's also testified multiple times in front of Congress on gun violence prevention. I look forward to Dr. Saccharin's presentation on how healthcare professionals drive social change.
Well, good morning, and thanks, Dr. Stewart, for that generous introduction. And I just want to thank first Dr. Richmond, and congratulations on your presidency, and the program committee for the honor to be here today. You know, when I got this invitation, I thought long and hard about what I should talk about, and I went back and forth. And then, you know, instead of specifically focusing on gun violence, I decided that I was going to branch out a little bit, and I was going to talk about how healthcare professionals, regardless of what you're passionate in, can really make an impact beyond the bedside. And of course, I think when you get invited to do a named lecture like this, the first thing that I did was reach out to a few of my mentors. And I reached out to a couple of them, and they had a lot of sage advice. Dr. Feliciano, who gave the 2006 Sherman lecture, and Dr. Cornwall, who we heard from yesterday, who's our president-elect and gave the lecture in 2020. And the advice from both of them was actually very similar. And they really, I think, honed in on me wanting to focus on my story, but think about how my own narrative has impacted the work that I'm doing today. And Dr. Feliciano actually said to me, after he gave me a call, he said, Joe, he said, listen, he says, I'm going to actually send you something. I'm going to send you Dr. Sherman's picture. I'm going to send you his CV. So he sure enough did. And I didn't know a lot about Dr. Sherman at the time, but I learned a tremendous amount from reviewing his CV and his obituary. And he had, of course, incredible military service. As I think a lot of you know, he was an educator and was recognized by numerous teaching awards. He was a leader both locally as well as nationally. He was the president of the AAST. And I think one of the things that really stood out to me that was so powerful was the fact that he really loved being a clinician. And this quote, which you can find in his obituary, really stood out. And I just want to read it for a second. He said, surgery, the opening, exploration, and repair of the living human body is an awesome responsibility afforded to only a few. To be privileged to be counted among those is a high honor, surpassed only by being trusted to teach others this demanding and marvelous craft. And when I read this, I thought a lot about that concept, because it's something that I've often really internalized, where imagine someone coming into the emergency department or to your trauma center. They have no idea who you are. but they're willing to put that trust in you. And that's only surpassed by the fact that he believed in training the next generation of healthcare leaders in America. So it's just really such an honor to be here, to be able to give this lecture. And I feel, even though I didn't know Dr. Sherman, I feel a lot of the core values that he represented were very much prevalent in how we practice today. I can't really begin this talk without starting with these two individuals, Dr. Bob Ahmed on the left and Dr. D. Mukherjee on the right. As you heard from Dr. Stewart, you know, my life really changed at the age of 17, where I went from being a healthy high school senior to collateral damage after I was shot in the throat with a .38 caliber bullet. And so I begin with these two individuals because them, along with their teams, provided me with this second opportunity. And, you know, honestly, when I initially went through it, I was 17. I had no idea what I wanted to do in life. I didn't realize the fact that I was mortal. And that moment really inspired me, and it led me down this path. And I think what happened, honestly, was the fact that in my eyes. And he came in and he did something that really changed the trajectory of my life. He said, Joe, he said, listen, what happened to you was terrible. But either you can feel sorry for yourself, which I think is tough love, especially from an immigrant father, or you can take that moment and turn it into something that impacts the lives of other people. And it was really that moment where I was inspired to go into medicine and really wanting to become a trauma surgeon. And at that time, my reasoning was to actually be able to give other people the same second chance that I was given. And I think what I found out as I was going down this path, as you'll see, is while being a clinician is incredible, I realized that the impact beyond the bedside was also important. I ended up going to Inova Fairfax Hospital, where I did my general surgery residency. And that's, of course, where I was a patient at. And to be able to operate and to train with the surgeons that saved your life, that's a whole nother talk. But it was, you know, frankly, just an incredible experience. And it was also a nerve-wracking experience because I felt like I had to be the best that I could potentially be. When I left Fairfax, I ended up going to Penn, where I did fellowship there. And I think, you know, every time you finish a part of your kind of training cycle, you feel like, okay, you got it, you know it all. And I felt that way, you know, as a chief resident. And then when I got to Penn, I realized that I still had so much to learn about what it means to care for the injured patient. And that experience was just tremendous, not just from the mentorship that we got, but also from my co-fellows and the people that surrounded us that really allowed us to kind of excel both clinically and academically. And I kept really asking myself, I think, a couple questions when I finished. And that was that, you know, all of the stuff that we're doing, taking care of these patients, is so critical, but what are we doing to prevent these injuries from happening? And that's where this motto from the Bloomberg School of Public Health, where it says, protecting health, saving lives millions at a time. I think this reflects both the opportunity and the responsibility that we have to think beyond the trauma center, to think beyond the four walls of the hospital. And it's what took me to the Kennedy School, where I spent a year studying public policy, really understanding the importance and the value of political will. Well, as all of this started, you know, kind of coming together, I realized that I still didn't understand the practical aspect of the legislative policymaking. And I ended up afforded the opportunity to spend a year as one of the National Academy of Medicine Robert Wood Johnson Health Policy Fellows in the U.S. Senate. And that was a tremendous year for a whole variety of reasons. I was with Senator Maggie Hassan from New Hampshire, who sits on both the Finance and the Health Committee. For those of you that are familiar with these committees, you'll know that these pretty much are responsible for governing healthcare in America. And I started in 2019, right before COVID happened. And I remember the first week that I started, we started to hear about this potential virus. And I said to the health staff, I said, hey, do you think we should, maybe mention something to the boss? And he said, okay, yeah, that's fine, but just one line. The next week, everything, was completely turned on its side. That was the only thing that we were talking about. And I had this opportunity as a public health practitioner and as a healthcare worker to be on the front lines of trying to figure out from a policy perspective, what can we put in place to really protect the health of millions of Americans? And it was just a tremendous experience. All of us are here because of so many different individuals. And, I don't have enough slides to include everyone, but I just want to say that I'm so grateful for the people in my life that have just continued to be there and to support me in so many different ways. And it's not just those that are, ahead of me, but it's also those that are coming up behind me. And this is a term that I've been recently using, reverse mentorship. And I think it's actually quite important. Sometimes we don't realize that the people that are coming behind us can actually teach us quite a bit. And I'm just so grateful for these individuals. They've really just been an incredible part of my life. So quickly today, we're going to really talk about a couple different things, really thinking beyond what I call the bedside, the importance of civic engagement. We heard a little bit about that yesterday, the power of storytelling and the need for authentic leadership. And I'll just start with this. This is something that I'm sure a lot of us who take care of trauma patients are familiar with, these pages that we get, where I got this about a couple months ago. A 16-year-old kid was coming in with a gunshot wound to the head. He was awake, alert, talking. This was the initial scout. And you can take a look at this one slice of the CT scan. Now, I knew based off the CT scan that despite the fact that this kid was awake, alert, and talking, that he wouldn't be this way for much longer. He had an injury to his sagittal sinus and it was going to be devastating. And I was so anxious because what I was trying to do in that moment was I was trying to connect him with his parents, because I realized that this might be the only chance for him to have a couple more minutes with them. We're going to come back to this in a second, but I point this out to say that despite how good we may think we are as clinicians, as trauma surgeons, as trauma centers, right? The best medical treatment here is prevention. So I want to share with you, right, in these 20 minutes, just lessons that I have personally learned. And I hope that they will be valuable to you regardless of what you happen to be interested in. Some of these lessons will be related to firearm prevention, but some will be related to other things that we're working on. And I have really 5 key concepts for you. The first is policy is not equal to politics. The second is authentic communication is critical. It's important, of course, to have the right idea, but you have to have the right strategy and approach. The fourth is power of innovation. And the fifth is what I call the 4 Ps, and you'll see what they are. We must intervene in the larger political, economic, and social arenas, and more fully engage in advocacy that will lead to progress and policies that protect the public health. Often, right, we don't think about it this way, but taking those bold decisions to integrate advocacy as a strategic pillar is so critical. And embracing civic engagement allows us to bridge the political divide and overcome our bias as we understand the efforts of how we communicate and how we advocate. And often people think about policy and they confuse it with politics. They're very different. Now they can cross over, and that's why I show these examples. I have crossed over into different arenas at different times. But the civic engagement that we have is so critical. And we heard about this from Dr. Cornwall yesterday, where he talked about Dr. Yancey's civic engagement in the Board of Education, thinking about how we as part of society are part of the change that we want to see. And when you think about health, think about the fact that regardless of what you're passionate about, right? Or regardless of some of the social issues that we're facing, health is interconnected to so many of them, whether it's gun violence or COVID or climate change or immigration. And guess what? Communities, they often trust us. We're often trusted public messengers. We have to learn how to continue to build that trust with our community, to continue to stay evidence-based and data-driven, but also understand how do we transmit and communicate messages in ways that can resonate and pull on the hearts and minds of everyday people. You know, advocacy often gets a bad rap. It's often, many people think of advocacy as a dirty word. And I'm here to tell you it's not. And when you think about advocacy, I think really for me, it's about changing those upstream factors, whether it's different pieces of legislation or regulation or institutional practices, right? And those changes allow us to impact populations, right? And that's powerful. Now, it's super complex, right, to change laws at the federal level. When you look at this, you know, very chaotic graphic, you're like, oh my gosh, where do I even start? And that's why it's a combination of things. And that's why all of us need to be part of that process. It was over 10 years ago that we started talking about gun violence as a public health issue. It's finally started to catch on. And I can tell you, there was a number of things that happened. One of which is surgeons decided that, you know, even though we're an apolitical profession, we have the responsibility to have a voice about this. And we saw, of course, what happened in 2018 when the NRA came after doctors. And it was not just docs, but healthcare professionals across the board that said, no, actually, we're at the center of taking care of these patients. We're at the center of talking to these families, these moms and dads. And so not only we are part of the solution, but we're a critical component. And that led to a variety of different things that happened, including the American College of Surgeons hosting the first medical summit that brought together 44 different medical organizations from across the country. I'm happy to tell you that we just had the second summit, and that's going to be, the proceedings are about to be published in JACS in the next couple of weeks. What's interesting is when we had that first summit, people were very hesitant about talking about policy. Let's just talk about this from a public health approach. You know, we want to stay away from policy. This second summit was very different. The needle continues to be pushed forward because clinicians, right, and healthcare professionals realize the power of their own voice and the responsibility they have to be part of that societal change. There's different, you know, folks that we've testified both on the local and state and federal level. What I'm showing you here is it's a combination of things. There's also a lot of stuff that's happening in the community, and the community is so critical because most governing in America happens at the local and state level, not at the federal level. And we sometimes forget about our own backyard. This is a great example, Dean Goldberg and Scott Charles, that have done tremendous work in Philadelphia and engaged the community. And when you think about why this is so important, it's because the people in the community, those that are closest to the struggle, understand the solutions. We have to make them real partners, not go to them and tell them what they should be doing, right? That's the real type of change that we need to see. Daniel Dawes, one of my colleagues from Satcher Health Leadership Institute, he was executive director there. Now he's the inaugural dean at Meharry in public health. He wrote this book, Political Determinants of Health. And we kind of flipped that concept and wrote a piece in the Scientific American about the political determinants of gun violence to really focus on the structural components of violence that we are seeing in cities like Baltimore and Chicago and Philadelphia, because only policies can fix what policies have created in the first place. And these, structural changes are not easy, right? But they require us to be invested in them so that they can happen over time. And because of all of the changes that we have seen at the local and state level, that has led to changes that we saw recently at the federal level. I think a lot of you saw last year the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, the first piece of legislation at the federal level in nearly 30 years that had a multifaceted bipartisan approach to it. It was tremendous. And it was because of people like yourselves, the moms wearing the red shirts that were coming up, going to the state houses, that allowed us to change the temperature and the culture of the country. But is that enough? No, that's just one step. Like any other complex public health problem, we have to continue moving forward. This is a piece I wrote afterwards about how there is no one solution to these complex problems. People always ask, well, what's the one thing that you would do? Well, there is no one thing. Depending upon the type of mechanism and gun-related injury you're talking about, it may be different. So we have to engage all sectors and break down the silos so we can work together cohesively. And the healthcare system is so critical in that process. Now, advocacy and the policy piece can also be published in journals like JIM. And this is a piece that we wrote with Dr. Rivera and Hargarden about the national approach to violence prevention, where we talk about really linking up what's happening at the local and state level at the national level. So I just hope that this shows you that healthcare workers are so critical in making great policy. In order to do that, we have to understand the policy process, but policymakers also have to understand the importance that we have in helping them understand what's happening on the front lines. Now, the second thing is authentic communication. And this is so critical for a lot of reasons. And I show this picture because I think the young people in this country have really demonstrated to us what it means to be an authentic communicator. And when I was finishing fellowship at Penn, we used to have this program where we'd bring high school students from around the country, around the city, into our trauma center. And we'd give them a tour of the trauma center. And then I would talk to them about gun violence. And the first time I did this, I hadn't told them my story yet. And I was just talking to them about, the public health problem. And they were kind of listening to me, but not really. They're 14, 15-year-old teenagers. And then I told them my story. And all of a sudden, all of their eyeballs focused on me. It was a reaction that I hadn't seen before and one that I wasn't expecting. And what I realized in that moment is I went from being, this guy wearing a white coat to someone that these kids could relate. And I asked them, how many of you have been impacted by gun violence in your community? And nearly every one of them raised their hands. So telling your story is critical. And one of, I think, the world experts was one of my professors from the Kennedy School, Marshall Gans, who talks about the story of self, the story of us, and the story of now. And I think the point here is this, is that in order to understand how to go from value to action, right, it's done through emotion. And that doesn't mean being an emotional basket case. It means being able to tell your story, right? And the story doesn't have to be, by the way, as dramatic as being shot in the throat. Each and every one of you, right, you have a story to tell. And figuring out what that is and how you deliver is so critical. If you haven't seen this Simon Sinek talk, this is so critical. He talks about this golden circle concept, which is, the why, the how, and the what. And the point of this TED talk is this, is that if, right, you look at very successful companies and you look at why they're successful not because they told you how they're going to do something. They're successful because they got you to believe in what they believe in. And that's the why. The third piece is a strategic approach. And, I like to show this picture. I was in the fire department when I was in college. And, some of you are probably looking at this picture and thinking, oh, there's Joe, another photo op as the building behind him burns down. I'm here to tell you that this was a training exercise, right? So we had just come out of the building as the other team went in. And the point here is this, is that how many times have you been in a room where someone says something that you don't necessarily agree with, right? And if you think about what happens to communication at that point, at that time, you stop listening to them and they stop listening to you, and communication breaks down, not just for that one moment, but for future interactions, because you remember that's the person that said something I didn't agree with. So I just show this to you to say that, listen, perception is not always reality. We have to try to listen to each other and understand the different vantage points. And when I think about the formula around firearm prevention, really, for me, it comes down to easy access of firearms, right? And you can take any one of these different pieces, whether it's easy access plus hate, easy access plus dementia, alcohol, impulsivity, right? And that leads to catastrophic scenarios. And so when you think about, well, what's the strategy to change that culture? There's a lot of different ways. One of the ways is we created a Hollywood Committee on Guns, where we're trying to change a culture through TV and film because we understand the power of doing that. And in fact, there's some precedent for it. There is a mental health guide that experts in the health field created to help writers and directors teach them about how to incorporate this into scripts. So you can imagine from a gun safety perspective, I'm not saying we're getting rid of all of guns, out of TV and film. That's not the point. But instead of maybe someone putting their gun on the desk drawer, they put it in the safe as an example. So it's those type of things that we think about that hopefully can help change that culture over time. So, success, right? When you think about having the right idea is critical, but the strategy and approach is also just as important. So the fourth piece is innovation. And I show you this now. I think some of you are going to be a little bit blown away because this has nothing to do with firearms. But I want to ask this audience a couple of questions. The first is, how many of you in here know someone that's had ovarian cancer? Can you raise your hands? Okay. I don't know if you all are looking around, but a lot of people raise their hands. Okay. How many of you in here know that ovarian cancer comes primarily from the fallopian tube? Okay, more hands than I expected. Pretty impressive. So a couple months ago, I'm doing a combined case with one of the gynecological oncologists, Dr. Stone. And I just had a family relative that had ovarian cancer, stage 4, terrible situation. And I said, Rebecca, I said, can you just explain to me, why are we not removing the fallopian tubes to help prevent ovarian cancer? And I had just undocked from the robot, and she was at the bedside, and she said, don't move. She unscrubbed and came to me, and I thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to be in real trouble right now. And her whole face is pale. And she says, Joe, she says, that's exactly what we're working on. And this turned into this whole 2-hour discussion that led to all these other different things. It turns out, right, that ovarian cancer affects 1 in 78 women, and 80% are high-grade serous that happen in the fallopian tube. So about 20% are primarily from the actual ovary, and most of those are low grade. So you're going to be wondering, well, why are you talking to us and how are you involved in ovarian cancer? I get it. Just bear with me a little bit. So when you look at most of these women, right, most of them are not related to they're not genetically related, right? And so when you look at these trends and how this progresses after the age of 45, you can see that it's impacting a tremendous number across this country. And so there's this concept that was developed called opportunistic salpingectomy, where essentially gynecologists are removing the post-reproductive fallopian tube at the time of another abdominal pelvic surgery to prevent ovarian cancer in women that are average risk. Well, okay, that's kind of fascinating, right? And if you look at some of the data, what we find is that if you do a bilateral salpingectomy, you can reduce the risk by 65%. Well, this got to kind of exploring some of the other data, and you can find that not only is there cost effectiveness data, but you're preventing 1,800 plus deaths, okay, from ovarian cancer if you replace the tubal ligations and if you do the salpingectomy during the hysterectomies. So you're probably still wondering, well, how is this related to us, right? Well, there's this multi-institutional study that's happening right now that we're a part of, where we're trying to branch this beyond the gynecologists, where general surgeons, urologists, all sorts of other abdominal pelvic surgeons are involved in this prevention piece. And really, they came to me and said, hey, listen, you've been involved in public health campaigns. Help us think about this. Help us rebrand this. And that's what we've been doing, thinking about the educational piece, thinking about tracking long-term outcomes, understanding the coding concepts of it, and really developing a pathway where this can become almost standard of care in women that are post-reproductive, that are undergoing other abdominal pelvic surgeries. And, I thought, of course, being at Hopkins, we often don't think of surgery as a prevention kind of tool, but in this case, it is. And it takes a lot of different people. You can see here, this is just the task force that we have at Hopkins, but it takes much more than just this. It takes a very diverse group of individuals, from marketing, from funders, from people like Cliff Coe at the college, right? For us to come together and rethink, how are we going to shape this concept of prevention? And this is something that, frankly, a lot of people hadn't thought about for years, because, they just kept it's almost like reading an essay. You never see your own mistakes until someone starts thinking about it from a little bit of a different angle. Last week, this caught on, and you can see this was published both in the New York Times as well as the Washington Post, about pushing forward with some of these different concepts. So I'm helping them with the rebranding piece. And, the term opportunistic salpingectomy in my mind is a very terrible term, right? It sounds like, people are preying on women. So there's a lot of work to be done to make people understand the prevention concept of this surgical intervention. The last thing I just want to leave you with are the 4 Ps. And this is what I call purpose, passion, patience, and perseverance. And I think this has been very helpful for me, but also some of my medical students and trainees that have come along. And I start off with purpose over position. And what this really means to me is the fact that, there's a lot of red shiny lights out there, and it doesn't mean you have to grab all of them. Understanding the purpose of what you're doing often keeps us grounded. And I think, for all of us, right, as humans, ego is innate. But the difference is you can't be driven by ego. And I think this is something that always continues to kind of remind me of why it's so important to really understand the work that I'm doing, the work that you're doing, and keep that why at the center. The second, of course, is you have to be passionate about what you're doing, but being passionate is not enough. And the funny thing about being passionate is most passionate people are not patient, and most patient people are not passionate. And you need that combination in order to persevere and transcend the challenges that each and every one of us are going to face. And that will allow you to carve out your own authentic path. I struggled a lot with this when I finished fellowship, because I was looking at people ahead of me and I'm like, oh, I got to be R01 funded. I got to do all these different things. And I'm like, wait, that's not authentic to who I am. Yes, funding is important, but I was going to do it kind of my way, the way I thought would resonate with the work that I was doing. And that's hard, especially when you may not have other examples. And I only realized this when people that were coming behind me said, hey, Joe, how did you end up at the Kennedy School? How did you go to the Senate? And started to kind of open up different pathways and alternatives for the next generation that I think are really, frankly, thinking very different than us. So, all of us have to learn how to tell our public story. Marshall Gans, says this, very often. And I think he says this if you're in public life, but frankly, I think for all of us, regardless of whether or not you're in public life, being able to understand and tell your story is so critical. So I just want to leave you with, what's your story? I think about my dear friend, Gabby Gifford, who, talks about courage. And I think we have to have the moral courage to really do the right thing. We have to have the moral courage to kind of step off the sidelines and be part of the solution. Far too often, we have, most of the burden on the shoulders of a few people. And so this is, something that I just encourage all of you, if there are things that you're interested in, that you're passionate about, you can be part of that change. And there's different ways to do it. And starting in your own community is critical. I think about the work that I do and why do I get up and do it every day? And I think, frankly, it comes down to the fact that having to talk to moms and dads and explain to them that their child is never coming home again is the worst part of my job. And I often remember this story where we had a 17-year-old kid who had a devastating traumatic brain injury. And I went up to the ICU to talk to his mom, and I see his mom through the glass window, standing at the bedside, holding onto his hand. And I did almost like anything that I could do not to go in there. I was wasting time. I was like looking at the scan again, talking to consultants, because it just every time I do it, a piece of me dies. Can you all hear me now? Okay. So I went in there and I began explaining to this mom the devastating injury her son had. And she began telling me about her son, about how he was the first in their family to graduate from high school, how he had these hopes and dreams of going to college, none of which will ever come true. And as she did this, she looked at us and she saw how emotionally impacted we were as a team. And she walked over and she did something I'll never forget. She put her hand on my shoulder and she said, "Are you okay?" I just want you to think about that for a second. Here's a mom that like just lost her son, and she's asking us if we're okay.
Stay with me. So on behalf of the on the Southeastern, I'd like to recognize Dr. Saccharin with this award and to thank him for such a powerful message with such a personal perspective. So please accept this on behalf of the Southeastern. Thank you so much for coming to deliver the Sherman address. We so much appreciate you. Okay, so the next part of our program is going to be a session on the challenges for new surgical chairs. We have 4 panelists.